All right, so as we've said, welcome everyone to our session of our Breathe Notice Now, our series that's running from March to April. And so we've got, I believe it's 6 weeks altogether that we're offering this time around for our Breathe Notice Now, which are a series of online mindfulness we've been offering for a few years now, believe it or not. For those that are part of this community, we started this about 3 years ago, and it continues. And so I had lots of asks to start up another one, and so I'm thrilled to be joining you tonight for our series of Breathe Notice Now. And so just as always, I like to introduce myself to folks that are on the call that maybe I have yet a chance to meet, or for some of you, if maybe you forget a little bit about me, I just thought I would offer some info. And so my name is Adriana, or if you'd prefer, you can call me Addie. And I work alongside my colleague, Peter Marks, who's the CEO of an organization called the Center for Conscious Care. And what we do there is essentially we support people who have an intellectual developmental disability or autism and their families who may be experiencing some concerns around how we can best provide support, because maybe their loved ones might have a fair bit of anxiety, and we traditionally work with teams that are helping someone to help lower their anxiety. I also work alongside my colleagues over at Community Living Windsor. I've been doing that now for about 15 years already, which is incredible. And at Community Living Windsor, again, we're an organization that provides supports to about 650 people and families in our Windsor community, who are essentially adults who have an intellectual developmental disability or autism. And the work that we do there is really varied. It all just depends on what the person wants to help them achieve a life of their choosing. And so we do a lot of different work there down at Community Living Windsor. I think what I've come to recognize, though, in both my roles of working in the developmental service sector is this tool of mindfulness and building our ability to become much more self-regulated. It really has been a bit of a game changer, this skill set between, what we would traditionally say is good service provision and just really excellent outcomes for people. In my time of doing some education with the mindfulness and this model called the Center for Conscious Care and Support, mindfulness, I'm often told, has just been a tool that can not only help professionally, but also personally, and starting to maybe help relate to things a little bit differently, like difficult emotions or difficult thoughts. When we're mindful with them, we can relate a little bit differently, and therefore we can just enhance our overall well-being. And so as much as mindfulness has come to me professionally, there's definitely a lot of personal value that's associated with the skill set as well. When I think about mindfulness, I've been practicing mindfulness now, for about 7 years, which is incredible. I have a regular practice, and I've also been facilitating in-class and online learning around mindfulness with the University of Toronto, and I've been doing that for a few years now as well. I'm also a registered psychotherapist qualifying here with the College of Registered Psychotherapists of Ontario, and I'm just currently completing my Master's of Arts in Counseling Psychology, and so in about 5 weeks, school will finally be done. And so I bring to our evenings with one another with Breathe Notice Now, just my lens through the disability world, and recognizing, when the feet are on the ground and when you're working in human services, how mindfulness can really help us build our self-regulation when we're actually doing the work with folks. And then I also bring the lens of just emotional wellness and taking care of self through the lens of psychotherapy. And so just know that when we are with our time, when we're together, what's presented for you is just for educational purposes. right? Like this isn't, unfortunately, counseling sessions, but we recognize that the information that we offer could maybe be really helpful for you to explore. But at any time, if you are feeling the need, we often will suggest to connect with a clinician, mental health clinician, to help you out if that's kind of more of what you're looking for outside of these sessions, outside of just education. And so I thought I'd just review the schedule, right? And so knowing we're together for, it's actually about 5 weeks, not 6 weeks. And so today we've got an hour and a half intro session of where I'm going to kind of orient us to the skill of mindfulness, orient us to this thing called the human predicament that we're working with, that when we're mindless, it can really pull us to our less than optimal self. So today's going to be a nice kind of introductory day of what we're working with this human predicament, and then the skill set of mindfulness. And then for the following 3 weeks, we're going to do deeper dive sessions, and they're going to be about an hour long. And we're going to do deeper pieces into mindfulness itself, the skill set, and how we can use it. And then we've got, for our last session, as always with our Breathe Notice Now, we offer a 90-minute Ask Me Anything session with Peter Marks, who's my colleague and the CEO of a Center for Conscious Care. And he's also a very seasoned mindfulness practitioner, and he's been involved internationally as a mindfulness facilitator since the early 90s. And so he's got a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge around the tool of mindfulness. And so we're just always so grateful to have him join us in our last sessions. And it really is an Ask Me Anything session. And so it could be anything from your practice, if you've got some questions about the practice, or maybe the why to get involved, or other things to consider, or self-compassion, or whatever it might be. It really is an Ask Me Anything session with Peter. And so that's going to be our time for what the schedule of Breathe Notice Now is going to look like for this series. And so if you haven't yet already, make sure you get those dates in your calendar, okay? And so when we get together weekly, we have sessions kind of laid out, and this is essentially what our time is going to look like. And so every time we get together, we're going to do something called a grounding exercise, just to kind of get you oriented to being right here, right now. We're going to do a review of Be Fit Mindfulness, which is the framework that we use here with Breathe Notice Now, which we'll get into in a little bit. We'll also always have a guided mindfulness practice with one another. And then we'll offer some time for discussion and wrap up if there's time. And so that's essentially what our weekly gatherings are going to look like. And so for those that are new, welcome. For those that I haven't seen in a while, great to see you again. And so let's look at today's agenda. Essentially, like we said, we're going to start off with a grounding exercise. I'm going to introduce you and orient you to this thing called the human predicament. I'm going to talk a little bit about Be Fit Mindfulness, this framework of mindfulness that we're going to use through our time with Breathe Notice Now. I'm going to do a body and breath awareness mindfulness practice, just bring our awareness to the breath itself. And then we'll do a wrap up. And so why don't we get started off with our grounding exercise? And this is a really simple one that you could maybe use for yourself, or if you're working with someone, maybe as a coach in some sort of way to help somebody self-regulate or get grounded and being reoriented to the here and now. This is a really simple one. Where it actually involves a body sensation as well. And so feel free, if you want to do this with me, great. If not, you can kind of observe and put it in the toolbox for next time, whatever you choose. But this one is essentially a grounding technique that brings your awareness to the breath, but it also brings your awareness to some body sensations on the hand. And so essentially what we're going to do is trace our hand as we breathe. And so I'm just putting my hand like this so you can see what I'm doing. But typically people would probably pull their hand this way or maybe even down lower and just trace their finger. But just so you can see what I'm doing, that's why I'm holding my hand out this way. And so holding one hand out, we can take our finger and we're just going to trace the outside of our hand. And as we go up the finger, we're going to breathe in. And as we go down the finger, we breathe out. And now take another breath in and breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. And inhale again. And exhale. And say if 5 breaths wasn't enough to get oriented, you can continue doing it again. Bring your finger down on the circling the palm of the hand, and you can get right back at it again. Breathing in and slowly breathing out. And so feel free to continue doing that as I kind of wrap up on this grounding exercise. But it's a really beautiful way to ground yourself with your breath, recognizing inhale and exhale with the rise up finger and down the other side. But it also has a physical element of grounding too, because you bring your awareness to the body sensation as you trace the palm of your hand. And so it's just a beautiful grounding exercise. So you can use something like that, like I mentioned, for yourself. Maybe if you're starting to feel anxious or you're starting to start to work with a difficult feeling and you just need to take 5 or take a breath. I often tell folks, just take 5 and you can circle your hand as you breathe, and it can help gear yourself back to being present. And if you're working with folks, with others, if you want to be a coach, we can start to coach as well. And so in my world in supporting folks who have intellectual disabilities, sometimes that physical connection to the breath can be really helpful to help get somebody grounded. And so that's just one of many different tools that we're going to be talking about or exploring actually with our Breathe Notice Now sessions. And so that's our grounding exercise for today. So let's start off unpacking this thing called the human predicament. And I could spend hours unpacking this one, but I only have a few minutes. There's so much that, we are all working with that really create this prison. And, it's essentially something that I like to, kind of frame as the human predicament's almost like this thing that has us putting our foot on the brake as we're trying to put our foot on the gas to be our best selves, right? So I know you have had an experience in your life of where you've said, why did I just say that? If I only just waited a couple more minutes, I would have said it differently. Or perhaps you have been pulled into a power struggle, or you started to feel a difficult feeling. Someone started to challenge you. And if you thought about it a couple minutes longer, you would have been like, it's really no big deal. Why did I feel I needed to get so upset, right? And so know that it's not you that's listening to me right now that experiences this gripping power of this thing called the human predicament. It goes a lot deeper than that. It goes a lot more deeper into our subconscious selves. But knowing that this human predicament, we're all working with it. It's just essentially a part of the journey of being human. We've decided to come into this lifetime being human rather than a newt. Right? So this is just something that we're working with. And there are ways in how we can better navigate this predicament, but I think it's really important that we unpack it a little bit before we get at how do we better navigate it. And so that's what I'd like to take some time for a little part of this evening, maybe for about the next 20 minutes or so, is really unpacking this human predicament that we're all working with. And I've been practicing mindfulness now for 7 years, and I still get driven by this human predicament every now and then. And it's just the nature of what it's all about, right? And so let's talk a little bit about this thing called our life setup, right? And so essentially, as part of this human predicament, we really need to talk about this thing called consciousness. Essentially in a 24-hour day, you can experience consciousness on a continuum of 1 to 10, right? And so when I think about the one end of the scale, this is being really unconscious. So it's essentially as you're sleeping in your bed. And then moving up the scale up to about the semi-conscious or this autopilot. Um, it's typically how you are in most of your doings in life, right? And then we move our way up on the other end of the continuum up to the 10 at being really fully conscious, really fully self-aware. And so this would be like when you're paying attention. And the example I give here on the slide is it's almost like you know what you're doing when a police car is following you, right? It's kind of like you're driving in that situation. You know exactly what you're doing. You're very aware of where your hands are. You're very aware of where your foot is. You're looking at your mirrors. You're very aware of your speed. You're very attentive to what you're doing, which is driving. And it's also when we're fully conscious, it's knowing that you are in the moment doing it, which is really tricky because for us, as we're designed as human beings, we either, our brain loves to be in the future, a couple of steps ahead so we can predict what's going to happen, or we like to be 2 steps behind and we think back and we reflect what was to be able to better manage what's coming. And so to be present or fully conscious, it's about being here now and noticing that we are in the moment doing whatever we're doing. It's also paying attention to what our body sensations, what our feelings, and what our thinking mind is doing and reacting to what's happening. And then we have this thing called the subconscious. And the subconscious is this data bank of files that we inherit and develop. And essentially, it's just because we're human, right? We have been gifted this thing of a subconscious. And so what I'd like to do is now just unpack this part of the subconscious because it really is an iceberg thing that we're working with. And so with this slide, it's a little busy, but I'm going to unpack it as skillfully as I can to help with some understanding here. And so if you look at the slide and you look at the right-hand side, we've got this iceberg. Right. And at the tip of the iceberg, we have this thing called the semi-conscious mindless mind, or this would be the autopilot self, that 5 on the consciousness scale. That would be that autopilot self. And that is essentially how we respond to most things and do most doings every day. Like how often are we on autopilot? Maybe more than you'd like to admit, but that's essentially how we go through our days, as being on autopilot or being semi-conscious. And at the underbelly of the iceberg, this is what we call some subconscious programming. Our autopilot self is so influenced by this subconsciousness. And for today, and for our language with the Center for Conscious Care, we call this the PFP, subconscious programming. And so what is PFP? Well, the first P stands for primitive predispositions. And so these primitive predispositions, another word for that might be the nature part of you. And so you've got these inherited genetic makeups, like drives for survival and reproduction. That's just something that we're working with, again, as being human. We have these primitive predispositions set up for us in our genetics, essentially. The F piece is called filters. And filters are these, another word for that might be the nature part of you, or the nurture part of you. And so this is more of these belief systems that get created from our childhood conditioning, right? Maybe in the family in which you grew up in, you started to piece together how to figure out as an organism, as a human, how to get your needs met and how to stay safe, essentially. And so you started to make these rules up around what you need and what you are and what others do to figure out how to best survive through your childhood conditioning. And so that would be a filters piece. And then the last P of PFP is what we call primed prompts. And these prime prompts are a little bit larger than just the family unit growing up, but they're more so these societal beliefs or these cultural priming in which we're in. So different types of understandings around what certain groups in our world, different cultures, how people, the in groups and the out groups. There's different types of stereotyping that's just out there in the larger part of our communities and our culture. And so we call this the numbed out part of you. And then, as we said, that semi-consciousness is that mindless part, that normal you that's essentially on autopilot for most of our days, right? And so we call this PFP a prison because essentially that underbelly of the iceberg has a lot of control over how we typically our autopilot self responds. And so this really is an iceberg predicament. When we think about the human predicament, it's really an iceberg predicament that we're really working with this deep subconsciousness that can pull us to our less than optimal selves, for sure. And so what I thought I would do is just unpack maybe this, let's talk about primitive predispositions first. And I just have a little exercise for you. And so just play along with me on this one. But this is the exercise. So you can understand a little bit more now that we've talked about the theory of primitive predispositions. Now maybe you can understand it and appreciate it a little bit more. And so I just have an exercise for you. And here's the task at hand. What I'd like for you to do is starting from 100, I want you to count backwards down to 0 in groups of 10. Ready? Go for it. Great. Pretty successful. Nice work. I have a task for you. This time it's a little bit different, but I want you to do your best. And again, we're going to start at 100, and I want you to count down to 0. Now by groups of 7. Ready? Go. Oh, I'll just stop the hemorrhaging now. That's a bit difficult, isn't it? Yeah. We say, oh, Addie, why? Most of us on the call, we're not accountants. We don't deal with money. Why are you asking us to do math tonight? Right? Well, interesting. That is just an example of a primitive predisposition. So here's what's happened. When I asked you to count down from 100 to 0 in groups of 10, what your brain did, you went over in your brain and you found a filing cabinet and you opened up the top drawer of the filing cabinet and you pulled out a folder that said, counting back from 100 in groups of 10, no sweat. You were able to open the folder and do it quickly. When I asked you the second time around, your brain went over to the filing cabinet, opened up the first drawer, and you went, oh no, there's no folder there. And so what I asked for you to do to count back from 7, so what I asked for you to do essentially is for you to open up a brand new folder. And that in itself is a primitive predisposition in the sense that you have a cognitive bias. Things that we put into our files or our folders is information that we have remembered that has meaning and has purpose for us, right? And so when we think about counting in tens, that served us a lot of purpose, right? You have rounded your coin counting and you've done your times tables, all of that since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, and you're really focused on tens because that is a little bit easier to manage in our world. And you were able to take that information and put that into a file because cognitively you were biased and that made sense to you. As when we were counting back from 7s, that wasn't meaningful for you. You've never had to really think or consider that because counting back from 10s makes a lot more sense, right? And so that is a setup of a cognitive bias. And you have many different implicit or cognitive biases, whether that's to do with tasks, with people, with expectations, right? You have cognitive biases everywhere because our brain is set up that way. We can't possibly take in all of the information all of the time about everything. We have to start to filter some things through because we would be so overwhelmed all the time with everything. So that's why one of our primitive predispositions is we set up some implicit biases here. And so we know the research that's out there around implicit biases, it can absolutely set us up sometimes of where we're putting our foot on the brake when we're trying to be our best selves, right? When we have cognitive biases about things. So that's just one example of a primitive predisposition. I like to now unpack this thing called filters a little bit more clearly. And so filters itself, this piece that's brought to you tonight is essentially from humanistic psychology. And so the grandfather of humanistic psychology in the Western world is Alfred Adler. And essentially he goes on to say that we start our lives perceiving that we're weak and vulnerable. And so both emotionally and physically. And so therefore we grope for ways to feel secure through inclusion in the herd. This inclusion then gives us a sense of counting for something and connection with others, which then we register as being safe, right? And so there's this piece of we're growing up, and for us to be able to survive, we need to make sure that we're included in the herd. And so to be able to do that, we had to figure out things kind of quickly, and we needed to become really good mind readers to make sure that we're able to strategize how we're going to get our needs met. And so some examples, actually, let's do this one first. And so this is another exercise that I'd like for you to follow along with too. And I want you to see if you can read my mind. I want you to see if you can guess what I'm thinking of. And so what's going to be presented in front of you is a couple of playing cards. And what I'd like for you to do is just see if you can guess what card I'm thinking of. And so the first set of cards that pop up on the screen, we have the Ace of Spades and the Seven of Hearts. And the card I'm thinking of is the Ace of Spades. The second set of cards that we have is the Three of Diamonds and the King of Spades. And the card I'm thinking of is the King of Spades. And the third set of cards we have is the Queen of Spades and the Six of Diamonds. And the card I'm thinking of is the Queen of Spades. And then we have this blue rule line that's on the screen here. And so just in that example of those three sets of cards, you started to formulate some rules that were helping you figure out what card I would guess next in the next pair. And so you started, I didn't tell you what these rules were, but you started to read my mind and you started to formulate some understandings to help you guess what I was thinking of. And so some rules that may have been created might have been, oh, Addie, you're picking all the same suit, huh? Or, oh, Addie's picking all of the black cards. Or, oh, Addie's picking all of the face cards. Maybe it's that pattern, zigzag back and forth. But you started to create these rules that would essentially help you guess that the next card I was going to choose would be the Jack of Spades. And so you have done this time and time and time again outside of card games. But you've done this many different times in life to figure out how you are going to get your needs met, right? How you're going to stay protected. And so you started to not just program rules around guessing cards, like I said, but you started to program rules around, how must I be? What roles do men play? What roles do women play? What's the world around me? What am I supposed to figure out here? And you even start to create in-groups and out-groups. And so these filters really are at this fundamental piece of really essentially setting up some perceptions or these, we use the word filters because it's almost like you wear a set of lenses that essentially differentiate between your subjective world and objective reality. And so you start to get programmed with these filters. And so some examples of filters. Many folks, again, these get created because folks are mind reading to figure out how they can be safe and included in the herd. And so this one is, I think I need to be in control or not out of control of most situations and people in order to feel okay. That can be something that Someone starts to know about themselves for them to feel okay and safe in the herd. Another example of filter might be, I need to be right and above criticism in order to feel okay. Another one might be, I need approval from important people in my life in order to feel worthwhile and okay. Another might be, I think that others in life must treat me fairly, or I have a God-given right to feel awful about it. Maybe another filter is, must be included or not excluded from social situations that I feel are important in order for me to have enough self-worth. I think I need to be superior to others in order to feel okay and worthwhile. Another one is this, I need to be busy and achieve in order to feel okay. And that boredom is incredibly painful and anxiety producing. And so these, again, are just some examples of filters that, again, get created in essentially our childhood conditioning, our family unit, and they typically get created up until about the age of 14 or so. And so when I talk about filters as well, these are going to die an hour after you do. And if we were to do some good work here, we would be able to narrow down that you've probably got one main one that you're working with for your lifetime. One of these, and we've got a couple others, but you're typically going to be working with one of these that are on the screen here. And when I talk about filters, I'm not in any way suggesting that one filter is better than the other. Not at all. They both have incredible fruits. They all have incredible fruits, along with being drawbacks, right? And so there's not one that's better than the other. And it's not about, when we look at filters, it's not about trying to change the one that you have. That's not it either. To skillfully work with these, because like I mentioned, they're going to die an hour after you do. It's really about knowing what filter you're being driven by at that subconscious level. And so that you can skillfully note it, and you can start to relate it to it a little bit differently. You can notice when your filter, this need to be in control, or maybe this need to be included, is pulling you into a direction that's really pulling you off to your less than optimal self, right? Maybe it's pulling you into a power struggle, or maybe it's pulling you into avoiding conflict at a time of where maybe some healthy tension is good, right? But these filters will drive us to be our less than optimal selves, which eventually is going to lead to us not offering our A game, whether that's professionally or personally, right? And so it's really about noting what filters you have, educating yourself on that, and then being able to identify and relate to it a little bit differently, rather than have it pull you to your less than optimal self. And so let's now talk a little bit about those primed prompts, that last P of that PFP subconscious, which is part of this human predicament. And so what I'd like for you to do, again, we've just got another experiment for today. And what I'd like for you to do is decide if you're just going to be a number 1 or a number 2. You choose, and you're all number 1 in my eyes, but just for this experiment, just decide if you're going to be a number 1 or a number 2. And then what I'd like for you to do is, I'd like everybody on the call right now just to close your eyes. Just play along with me on this one. It's safe to do so. Just play along, and I want everyone to close your eyes. And now for the number 1s on the call, what I'd like for you to do is open your eyes and take a look at the screen. I want you just to close your eyes. And number 2 is, I'd like for you to now open your eyes and look at the screen. And number 2 is just go ahead and close your eyes. And now I'd like for everyone to open up your eyes and look at the screen and say whatever animal first comes to mind. Just say it out loud. And so for many on the call, I'm going to hear that there are some ducks and there are some rabbits, typically. And more than likely, number 2s, you're going to report that you saw a duck because I had primed you with this image. And number 1s, you'll more likely say it's a bunny because I primed you with this image, which then would essentially change your perception of what you see in this image. And so knowing that is just one example of priming. I primed you through the visual sense store to then alter your perception of this image. Just another example of priming. How many farm animals do you see in this picture? You can go ahead and count them there. And now when I turn to the next slide, just think to yourself and say out loud, what's the first animal you see? So for many that are on the call, I could hear it already. I see a horse, I see a donkey, right? Well, could be because I primed you with this image beforehand of knowing farm animals or identifying farm animals. But for some, they might actually see a seal in this image. And so for those that are only seeing horses and donkeys, I'll give you a minute till you can find the seal. But for those that maybe see a seal in this image, well, there's a possibility that maybe you grew up and you were primed in your childhood. If you lived on the East Coast or the West Coast and you saw seals often, could be an explanation for that. Or maybe just maybe you were primed to look at something different. Addie's got something up her sleeve here. She primed us before with the ducks and bunnies. So I'm looking at this image and I should probably see if there's something else that's there. So you're primed to maybe look a little bit more deeply, look at something else. And so that is another example of priming. Last example of priming. And this is great MRI research that's been repeated time and time again. And this is with wine, right? And so I bring wine bottles to our Breathe Notice now, because I know our audience, we appreciate a good glass of wine every now and then. But here's the MRI research. And so say we are to put you in an MRI and we have electrodes and everything hooked up to your brain activity. And we give you a sip of wine from a $90 bottle of wine. And then we give you a sip of wine from a $10 bottle of wine. And don't your pleasure centers in your brain light up and become activated 3 times as much when you're taking a sip, taste from that $90 bottle of wine? But in reality, both samples are from the $10 bottle. And so what is that an example of priming? Well, we're primed to believe in this lifetime that more expensive must mean better, right? And so we think about priming, gosh, a whole industry is based on priming. Marketing, a multi-billion-dollar industry is made on priming. And so we have to recognize that this priming, which is everywhere in our culture, the things that we need to buy, what we need to look like, a whole bunch of different priming, it really can influence that subconscious part of us. And it can really put our foot on the brake when we're primed to believe certain things. It can either solidify a cognitive bias that we have, right? Or prime us to maybe put blinders on in other types of ways. It really does put our foot on the brake as we're maybe trying to be our best selves. And so I just asked the question, right? Could it be that this PFP programming at times is causing or seriously contributing to how we offer our less than optimal selves, perhaps more often than we'd like, right? Food for thought, for sure. And so now, setting up this predicament, and I know maybe I've kind of popped your bubble a little bit and maybe taken some wind out of your sails here, but I think it's important that we recognize this predicament that we're working in, because if you don't know you're in a prison with this human predicament, how on earth will you ever work your way to get out of it, right? And so it really is essentially recognizing the prison that we're in, and so that we can start to break out of it. Because the human predicament that we have, it doesn't have to stay that way. It's something that we're working with, but how we respond and how we relate to this PFP conditioning, that part we can change. And so this is where this tool of mindfulness beautifully comes in. And so when we think about breaking out of this PFP prison, it really is an inside job. And the key to getting out of this prison is the key of mindfulness, or raising our awareness, raising our consciousness. And so the very, very good news, right? The power and influence of that negative PFP programming can be significantly reduced, becoming more mindful or more conscious. And mindfulness, what it does, it actually rewires our brain's live drive modules to give ways to prevent and eliminate emotional hijacks, or those difficult feelings or power struggles we get pulled into, and enhances our capacity to actually make better choices here. And so instead of just knee-jerk responding to what our PFP tells us to do, mindfulness can help us make much wiser decisions. And so let's walk through now. I'm going to say maybe the next 15 minutes, I'm just going to introduce you to this tool of mindfulness and raising consciousness. And then we'll get into actually practicing a sit with one another. So I've got another exercise for you to do. What I'd like for you to do is just to write down your signature. And if you don't have a pen and a paper, that's just fine. You can just take your dominant hand and just finger right in the air and just go ahead and write your signature out. Lovely. Now what I'd like for you to do is to do this exercise, but I now want you to write your signature with your non-dominant hand. So again, take the pen and paper, write it down, or go ahead and use your finger and draw it in the air with your non-dominant hand. Now I'd like for you to repeat this exercise a third time, and I'd like for you to write your signature using your non-dominant hand, but I now want you to say to yourself, you can have that internal dialogue or say it out loud, and pay attention to what you're doing. So you can say, I'm aware that I'm writing my signature with my non-dominant hand. I'm aware that I'm writing my signature with my non-dominant hand. So go ahead and do that the third time round. Some of you, as we're completing this exercise, you might be working with this priming bed of, the third one's got to be better, right? Third time around's got to be better. That's just an example of priming again. But essentially, the big picture of taking away from this exercise, when I asked you the first time to write down your signature, you were on autopilot. You've done that a bazillion times before. You didn't even have to think about it. Out it went, right? When I asked you the second time around, I pulled your awareness a little bit further up on that consciousness continuum, because using your non-dominant hand, you became a little bit more aware of what you were doing. You're aware of the body sensations, even just holding your finger out and signing in the air. Your hand is just manipulating a little bit differently. You became a little bit more aware of what you were doing. And so instead of being on autopilot at that 5 level on that continuum of 1 to 10, I raised your awareness up a notch or two, maybe about to the 6 or 7. And then when I asked you to do that exercise the third time around, I raised your awareness up even more. You're aware of what you were doing, which was writing with your non-dominant hand. And so now we raise that notch up maybe to about the 8 or 9. So you're much more aware of what you were doing. And so that is essentially that purpose of the exercise, for you to be able to recognize those mindful experiences of being on autopilot and just relating and just doing as you normally do. But the third time around, paying more attention to what you're doing in the moment. And so BeFit mindfulness, and I'm just going to unpack this slide. It's a bit busy, but let me talk to it. BeFit mindfulness is a framework, like I mentioned earlier, that we use here with our Breathe Notice Now sessions. And for anyone who is engaging in mindfulness, any mindfulness is great mindfulness, right? So you might have different practices that you've picked up along the way. And this framework of BeFit mindfulness will definitely relate to some practices maybe of mindfulness that you use currently or have used in the past. But this framework of BeFit was actually co-created by my colleague Peter Marks, along with Shinzen Yang, who is an incredible and dear friend of us over at Center for Conscious Care. And he's done a ton of work with Harvard and their lead mindfulness consultant and researcher. And he's also written fabulous books. One I can think of off the top of my head is The Science of Enlightenment by Shinzen Young. And so if you have yet a chance to read that or want to kind of explore a little bit of mindfulness and his interpretation, I highly suggest the read. And so this framework of BFIT mindfulness created by Peter and Shinzen is secular in nature. And so what I mean by that is mindfulness that's out there. A lot of practices are connected to an Eastern tradition, typically, as we're BFIT mindfulness because of functional MRIs and the technology that we have accessible to us over the last 20 years, essentially. We can actually start to see what happens in the brain, the science behind mindfulness, which is essentially set a platform for this BFIT model to be created. And so, like I said, all mindfulness is good mindfulness, but the BFIT framework itself is secular in nature and built on science and study. And so, what is BFIT mindfulness? Well, BFIT is an acronym. B stands for body sensations, F stands for feelings, I stands for image thinking, and T stands for talk thinking. Yes, there are two ways in how thoughts come through the mind. And mindfulness itself is built on two pillars, if you can envision that. One pillar is this pillar of self-awareness, which is paying attention to what you're doing, paying attention to that you're doing it, and then knowing what the body, thoughts, and feelings are doing. You're very self-aware. That's the first pillar of mindfulness. But what's equally as important to awareness is this pillar of allowingness. And allowingness is this internal, subjective, just let it be. There's this internal, subjective ride and abide. And so we might notice some difficult feelings, and then we notice how they just ride and abide the wave, right? And so there's this internal allowingness. Allowingness itself does not mean to render yourself a lifeless blob without opinion or judgment in any sense. Yes, you can be able to judge, for your own subjective self of helpful or not helpful, or you might have opinions about certain things. And we strongly encourage that all of us, we have a responsibility to do what we can to passionately commit to helping alleviate suffering in the outside world. And sometimes it's making hard decisions to be able to hold people accountable, whatever it might be. So this allowingness isn't just the doormat of life, being a doormat of life. It's about skillfully, when we're having to work passionately to commit to helping change happen in the outside world, we always do so from a centered inside. And so the space of allowingness and just letting it be. And so with mindfulness itself, right, there are practical outcomes guaranteed. And for those who have yet a chance to really get to know me, I very rarely make guarantees in life. I think the two guarantees that I typically go along with is change is guaranteed in life, absolutely. And the other guarantee is that we all have an expiration date. Those are the two guarantees that I know in life. But with mindfulness, there are practical outcomes guaranteed. When we practice this skill set, again, it builds up through this awareness and allowingness. It builds up our ability to be much more self-regulated. We'll have fewer emotional hijacks. And so we'll be less likely to get pulled into power struggles or get pulled into our less than optimal selves. And if we do get pulled into them, they'll be less intense and we'll recover a lot faster. We can also experience greater happiness, moments of happiness. We'll be able to identify moments of happiness. And when we experience them, they'll be more intense and they'll actually last longer. We can have measurable growth of unconditional compassion. And so we'll get into this in a couple of sessions from now when we talk about compassion. But when we're actually practice the skill set of mindfulness, we start to talk to our brain architecture in certain ways, which actually help wire us to be much more compassionate people. And so we can build unconditional compassion. We can also have these increased intentional skills. And so intentional skills, the power of intention is incredible, and putting out, many different languages around that of manifesting or just intending to be good and positive and prosperous, or whatever it might be. The science around putting out intentionality of our purpose or intentionality of our experience is incredibly valid. And so we know that through mindfulness, we can have increased ability for intention. And then we also have increased entrainment skills. And so entrainment essentially means that I can help influence maybe the being of someone else, whether that's their emotional space or their regulation, right? Simply by, if I'm mindful and if I bring to a connection with someone, being calm and maybe having a lower heart rate and putting off this space of centeredness, just by being that, I can entrain that onto someone else. And so I know that you've experienced in life, I'm sure you've experienced in life, you are in a situation, the person you're around is incredibly heightened and they're something's going on. And then you just start to notice your nervous system going, what? And you start to raise and you start to maybe become more alert, right? And maybe you get pulled into a panic if they're starting to panic, right? I know you've experienced that. Because essentially, who you are is a beautiful, contributing spiritual being in this life. But what you are, when it gets down to it, is energy, right? And so when we entrain in this state, I didn't have to necessarily say anything in that example, but when we entrain energy, we can have the person kind of match us. And so when we're mindful, we can come from a centered space, a place of calm and compassion, and we can essentially just pass that on to someone else. So that's what I mean when I say entrainment skills. And so let's just remind you of being here now, right? And so I want you just to pay attention to what you're doing when we look at this circle here. I want you just to pay attention to what you're doing. So what you're doing right now is listening, right? And so you're piecing the words together that are coming out of my mouth and you're making sense of it. And you're also looking at a screen. And so you're paying attention, you are seeing and you're hearing right now. Now I want you to become aware that you are in the moment doing it. And so recognize the space in which you're in. Maybe bring some awareness of being here now. Maybe bring awareness to your body sensations. Notice how your shoulders are carried. Maybe notice how the bottom, your seat, or the backs of your legs are pushed up against the chair underneath you. Become aware of being here now as you are listening and seeing. And so just through that experience, we've been able to double, if not triple, your awareness to being here right now and being mindful. And so when I look at mindfulness as well, when we think about the building blocks of mindfulness, this pie is definitely the building blocks. And we've also got 4 tools for mindfulness. And so the 4 tools of BFIT mindfulness is, the first one is concentration. And so as we engage in these practices of mindfulness, and when we're gathered here with Breathe, Notice Now, a lot of our mindfulness practices are going to be passive practices. So they're going to be activities that we're going to do with one another, where we're going to be more sitting, more observing, right, with what's going on. But there's also other practices that are quite active. And so with mindfulness, folks can get into mindful walking or mindful gardening or mindfully listening to music, being very aware of what's going on. Or for folks that maybe play instruments and you get to a point of where you don't even have to focus on the different strings that you're strumming on the guitar, right? You're just so mindfully there. It just becomes part of it. And so again, when we're practicing mindfulness in our sessions with one another, they're going to be more passive rather than active processes. But concentration is one of the main tools for both active or passive practices. And concentration actually is a skill set that a lot of us are struggling with lately. And I think a lot of it has to do with technology And we don't need to use the muscle of concentration as much as we did before, right? Because our smartphones carry all of our phone numbers, carries all of our calendars, carries all of our important stuff. We just give it a Google and then we get all the information we need, right? So our ability to concentrate on a larger scale, studies are showing that it's actually kind of on the decline. Right. And so we know that concentration, if you don't use it, it's like a muscle. If you don't use it, it atrophies. And so we have to build this skill of concentration, build up the muscle. And if you think about working with people, because that's essentially kind of what's brought a lot of you here today, when we work with people, concentration is important. Right? Like we need to be able to concentrate on a conversation. Or maybe if you're working with someone that communicates not in a verbal way, you've got to really concentrate on making sure that you understand what they're communicating through gestures, maybe through a subtle change in an eyebrow. Like there are some times where concentration is incredibly valuable and just in that circumstance, right? But concentration itself is a muscle that we tighten up here as we practice our mindfulness. The second tool of mindfulness is this sensory clarity. And so essentially what sensory clarity is just getting really clear on what our senses are experiencing as we practice the skill of mindfulness. And so being aware of what our body sensations are experiencing through, our different sense stores. So maybe through what we're seeing, what we're smelling, what we're tasting, what we're touching, what we're hearing, become very aware through our sense stores. And then we also become aware of what our feelings, because our feelings essentially is another type of sensory experience that we have. And then also what the thinking mind is doing. So it's bringing in all of those pieces of our reality, our BFIT senses and our perceptions and misperceptions, getting really clear on what those experiences are. And so that's what sensory clarity is about. The third tool is this tool of allowingness, which we talked about on the slide before, this internal sense of just letting it be. And so another word for that is this equanimity. And so this ride and abide, or this internal balance of just noticing what our sensory stores are picking up on. And then we infuse this with the sense of internal allowingness. And then the fourth tool is this being here right now, this presence of being in the moment, which if you recall, as we talked about earlier, that can be difficult as we are wired as survival of humans to either be 2 steps in the future or 2 steps behind. And so the fourth tool of being here now is also incredibly important. And so those are the tools. And so what I'd like to actually do now is walk us through a set. It's about 7:30, so I'm just going to walk us through maybe about a 20-minute sit or so. And we're really going to focus on bringing our awareness to our body and our breath. And so I have on this slide here a microscope. And before we get into the exercise for about 20 minutes, I think it's really great just to kind of set up what mindfulness is a little bit more. And so essentially it's like a microscope for you to get much more clear on what your senses, your BFIT's doing, what your misperceptions and your perceptions are experiencing moment by moment. And so it's almost like you're sitting back, and the imagery that I use on this one is you're sitting back like a cat at a mouse hole, and you're just kind of watching what comes up. And you're just recognizing it for what it is. There's no judgment of whatever your experience is. You're just noticing it and then infusing it with that sense of allowingness. Or another imagery that I like to use is if you can, when we're mindful, we're mindless rather, for much of us when we're on autopilot, if you kind of think of like a baseball game, you are constantly a player in the game. You are so close to your feelings and your thoughts, they drive you all of the time, right? But when you're mindful, it's almost as if you are an observer sitting in the bleachers and you're just sitting and you're watching the show. And so you're noticing body sensations pop up, your feelings, your thoughts that you're having, but you're not it. There's a part of you that can sit back and just watch the show. And so those are some maybe images that could be helpful as you get into your mindfulness sit today. When I think about mindfulness, I think it's also really great to just throw out there for those that are maybe new on the call, or just as a nice reminder. There's a misperception of mindfulness, I think, that's out there. And the misperception is that mindfulness is going to pull you into a trance of where you will have no control over anything. It just makes you zen and nothing. You're in this trance. And I smile at that because, I hate to break it to you, but you already are in a trance, right? You're in your trance of every day to day. You've also been sitting here for about an hour listening to me. You're in a bit of a trance as it is now. And so when you're mindful, it's about pulling yourself out of that, being out of that autopilot, and again, just being really skillful and bringing this awareness and allowingness to what you're experiencing moment by moment. And so I just wanted to share that with you as well. So why don't we start to look with greater clarity? And why don't we get into our mindfulness exercise tonight? And again, I'll just kind of walk us through it. And I just encourage you that you participate as best you can and just be curious, see what comes up. Okay, there's no judgment for your experience. You're just noticing and being curious with this. And so let's get at it. So what I'd like for you to do is just find yourself in a seated position that's alert but relaxed. And if you're sitting on a chair, I find it sometimes a little bit helpful to bring your back off the back of the chair. It just helps with your posture a bit. If you can, if you can't, no worries, no judgment. But sometimes with our back off the back of the chair, it just helps with our posture. And against one of the dreaded ozons, which we call dozing, which at this time of day, maybe many of you might be feeling. And we call it the mindful bow of respect when we're in mindfulness retreats, but this dozing can kind of take over. And so with your back off the back of the chair, having your feet flat on the ground, feel free to put your hands on the tops of your thighs. You can even just fold them in your lap. And I want you just to sit up and settle in. And if you feel it's safe to do so, I'm going to ask that you close your eyes on this one. And if you don't feel it's safe to do so, that's fine. You don't need to close your eyes. But I'll ask that you kind of find a spot, maybe about a foot away from your toes on the floor, and just hold a soft gaze there on the floor. And if you're able to close your eyes, I just suggest that because sometimes when we are building the skill of mindfulness and paying attention, that it's a little bit easier when we can cut off the visual sense door. Instead of looking outwards, it helps us look inside a little bit more clearly. So sitting up and settling in, I just want you to take a breath in. Ready? Breathing into the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Now exhale up to 9. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Let's take another inhale. 1, 2, 3. Exhale, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And I just want you to continue to breathe this way. Breathing in and then slowly exhaling. And I want you to see if you can bring your noticing to your belly. So see if you can notice some body sensations every time you breathe in and slowly breathe out. Maybe you notice as you breathe in, the belly rises as it fills up with air. And maybe you notice as you exhale how the belly just gently falls back into place. You might notice a cinching of a waistband or a belt around the belly. But just bring all of your noticing right now to what the belly does. Every time you breathe in and slowly breathe out. And now what I want for you to do is continuing to breathe into the count of 3 and exhaling up to 9. I want you to bring your noticing to what your chest does every time you breathe. Breathing in, maybe you notice how the chest rises as the lungs fill up with air. And maybe you notice on the exhale how the chest just gently falls back into place. Maybe you notice this expansion and contraction of space at the chest with every breath. You can label rise on the inhale and fall on the exhale. But just bring all of your noticing to what your chest does every time you breathe. And you might have already started to notice that your thinking mind is kicked in, which is not unusual, but I just want you to do your best. Put that off to the side for now. And just come back and bring your awareness to the breath at the chest. And your only job right now is just to notice the body sensations of inhale and exhale. Rise and fall. Now I want you to shift your noticing away from the chest and shift it up towards the nostrils. And again, breathing in and breathing out. Just see if you can notice some differences of body sensations there. Maybe on the inhale, the breath's a bit cooler than the exhale. Or maybe one nostril's a bit easier to breathe through over the other. Or maybe see if you can bring your awareness right at that changeover between inhale and exhale. There's a stillness there. There's a pause there. And if you notice that, just label none. Just bring all of your awareness to the body sensations at the nostrils as you breathe in and slowly breathe out. Now let's continue on with our awareness, raising our awareness around body sensations. And I want you to bring your noticing now over to the left arm and shoulder. And on an inhale, again to a count of 3, tighten all of the muscles in the left arm and shoulder. And on a slow exhale up to 9, just slowly release. And I want you to bring your awareness to the released muscle sensations in the left arm and shoulder. Infuse it with that allowingness and tension. Just let it be. Release. Let it be. And just notice the body sensations in the left arm and shoulder. Now bring your awareness over to the right hip and leg. And again, on an inhale to a count of 3, tighten all of the muscles in the right hip and leg. And slowly exhale. Just slowly release. And again, just pick up on the muscles and those body sensations of release in the right hip and leg. Infuse that allowingness and tension. Just let it be. Just notice. Bring your awareness now over to the left hip and leg. Inhale, tighten. Exhale, slowly release. And again, just notice. Infuse allowingness here. Just let it be. Bring your awareness up to the right arm and shoulder, just as you've done before. Inhale, tighten. Exhale, slowly release. And again, just notice. I just want you to say to yourself here now, I want you to remind yourself that you're being present and mindful with right now, which is bringing your awareness to the body sensations, more specifically over to the right arm and shoulder. You're being mindful and present in the space, and just being curious and just observing. Now let's continue on with the body scan. And I want you to bring your awareness up to the face, and we're going to do something called a body scroll. And so we're going to scroll down the front of our body, just kind of picking up on different resistances or different areas of the body. And if we find any resistances or tightness, we're just going to infuse that allowingness and tension again. And so I want for you to bring your awareness now up to the hairline. And scroll your awareness now down over the forehead and along the brow. And just gently soften the brow. Just let it be. Bring your awareness now down over the eyes and along the bridge of the nose. And through the cheeks. Just let it be. Bring your awareness now down over your lips and over your chin. And into the lower jaw. Just release the lower jaw. Just let it hang. Just let it be. Bring your awareness now down to the throat. That's often the place in our body where we hold our sadness. We'll get a tightening in the throat. And so if you notice any resistance there, any tight muscles of the throat, just infuse them with allowingness and tension. It's all good. Just let it be. And bring your awareness down to the chest. And again, just noticing the rise and the fall with every breath. And bring your awareness back down to the belly. Again, notice rise and fall. Now what I'd like for you to do is I just want you to imagine yourself a game, just like that observer at the baseball game. And I just want you to take a seat in the bleachers. And I just want you to sit back and now kind of zooming out and looking at the body as a whole. Just see if you can notice, see where your body sensations take you. And so your awareness might be pulled over to maybe a pinching in the upper shoulders, in the mid-back. Or maybe your awareness gets pulled down towards your seat and the backs of your legs as they're pushed up against the chair underneath you. Or maybe your awareness pulls you to the breath at the nostrils. But you're just kind of going to float around. We call this a free float awareness. And so wherever your awareness pulls you is exactly where you need to be. And so you can skillfully label maybe the part of the body that the awareness gets drawn to. And then just infuse that experience with that allowingness and tension we've spoken of. Your awareness may get pulled somewhere else in a breath cycle, and so just follow it. Or your awareness might just want to hang around a certain part of the body for a few breath cycles, and that's fine. But just you're sitting back like that observer in the bleachers, just watching the show, labeling the locations of where your awareness pulls you, And just infusing this experience with that allowingness intention we've spoken of. And so for the next half minute or so, just sit back and be curious with this free floating awareness of body sensations. If at any time during the free floating awareness, if you're finding it hard to concentrate, you can always go back home to the breath, whether that's the nostrils, the chest, or the belly. Right, whatever's more predominant for you, maybe get oriented there for a breath cycle or two, and then just cast your net of curiosity out again. Just sit back with that free floating awareness. Great work. I just want you to bring your awareness down to the toes. You can give them a wiggle. Bring your awareness to the fingertips and give them a wiggle as well. And before we end our mindfulness sit with one another, as always, I like to end on having an attitude of gratitude. And so we just say some words of thanks to ourselves. So you may say something like, gosh, I'm so grateful to have friends and family in my life who love me and for me to love back. Or maybe you're grateful that you hopped on this series of Breathe, Notice Now tonight. And you're able to carve some time to get some learning blocks and maybe also just join some people in a community that are like-minded. Or maybe you're simply grateful for having this gift of one more day. Whatever it is, go ahead and be grateful and say it quietly to yourself. We also like to end and state some intentions. First, let's state an intention for ourselves. Maybe something like, I intend to participate mindfully and joyfully today. I intend to respond with wisdom and with kindness to not only those who cross my path, but also to myself today. I intend to be the best that I can be today. And next, let's state some intentions for others as well. We intend that others stay safe and healthy and well. And we intend that they find peace and joy in their day. And we intend that they be the best that they can be. And we do whatever we can to help them get there. And when you're ready, just go ahead and mindfully open your eyes. You can just hold this space a little bit if you choose. Bring your awareness out to the peripheral vision. So it's almost like you're just gazing out in front, but you're focusing on the peripheral vision. This is another technique of mindfulness called full field focus. It's just softening the visual sense door and not getting locked on to things, but just sitting back and taking a look, just a little different.
And so as we wrap up for our session tonight, I just wanted to thank you so much for your participation and carving
Some time today. I know it can be difficult at this time of day, and so I just very much appreciate your willingness to participate. Know that these sessions are going to be recorded, and so if there's a time that maybe you're unable to hop in, no sweat. You'll have them recorded. You can watch them at a later time, or maybe rewatch the content that we've explored when you've sat in on a live session. It'll all be available to you there. And so at any time, if you've got some questions, I strongly suggest that you check out the Center for Conscious Care website. You've got the link there on the screen. And then feel free to please email me directly. You've got my email address there. It's not unusual that I'll get a few emails throughout the week. And so that's, if you've got any questions, if you'd like for me to address some things as we're moving on in our Breathe Notice Now session, I will happily do the best I can. Just need to let me know and we can go from there. And so with that, I'm just going to wrap up for our session this evening. But again, many, many thanks. And we look forward to seeing you same time next week at 6:30 to 7:30. So it'll just be 1 hour next week. And I believe next week, we're going to be working with our body sensations more completely. And we're also going to start to unpack, how do we work with the thinking mind more skillfully? Like, how do we really sit in that bleacher watching the baseball game with our body sensations and our thoughts more completely? Because many of us have this misunderstanding as well, is that our thoughts drive us and should drive us into all of our conscious decisions. And sometimes, however, our thoughts are representative of our less than optimal self, right? And so when we can work skillfully with the difficult thoughts, we can be much more mindful and we can make much more conscious decisions from wisdom and based on compassion, rather than just being pulled into what our mindless thoughts tell us we need to do. And so we're going to skillfully work with that next week. But until then, hope you have a fabulous week. Thanks so much for hanging with me tonight. And we'll see you same time, same place next week. Take care, everyone. Have a great one.
Thank you, Addie. Bye.
Yeah, no problem, Tracy, and bye. Bye, Pierre.
Bye, Addie. Thanks.